Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
All right. So welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Jason Brown. I'm a cloud solutions architect with Bright Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me is software and data consultant Tom Kowalski.
Hello.
And we also have business technology consultant Joe Coleman.
Everybody, and just a reminder, if any of the listeners have any questions whatsoever, please throw them right here in the Lunch with Tech Leaders little chat box there. I'll make sure that we get to them and address them in the discussion. So thank you, Jason.
And that's on Discord for those of you who are listening. If you want
Yeah, it's live.
we're on Discord.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry about that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both. And yeah, also joining us today is our subject matter expert, Preston Frazier, senior software engineer from the Interoperability Institute. Welcome back, Preston.
Hey everyone, happy to be back.
All right. So in this episode, we're going to discuss serverless observability, logging, and monitoring. So there's a lot to cover in this one, so let's jump right in. And just to clarify, observability, what I mean by that is the window by which one can gain insight and understanding of what's going on in your system, what's going on in your environment. So how your system is functioning, how performant it is, just being able to gain an insight into what's going on there. And I feel like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just, how do you differentiate between like logging, monitoring? Is it kind of like the overarching putting them together, or would you say it's a little different?
Right, yeah. I mean, so I think that logging and monitoring are two key components in achieving observability for serverless architecture, right? And along with that, also, I would throw in distributed tracing. So I'd like to really get into that. But sort of just to kind of cover this in broad terms, like logging and monitoring and distributed tracing, I see as they have different roles, right? So like logging would involve capturing and storing relevant events, errors, any other information generated by your serverless functions, whereas monitoring would focus more on collecting real-time metrics about like the health, performance, and resource utilization of the actual functions themselves, right? So it kind of has a different role in logging versus monitoring. And then with tracing as well, it can really provide detailed insight into the flow and then the execution of requests across the different components, right? So you can see and map out how all of the different serverless components are working together, right? So just kind of like as a high view, that's what I would consider as like the role of each one in observing or achieving observability. But yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts as well, both Tom and Preston, on how they can work together to achieve observability, specifically in a serverless environment. I feel like we've talked a lot at length in previous episodes about logging and monitoring. So I'd like to focus more specifically on how it's different for serverless versus more traditional architectures. But yeah, so I guess with that, like just to start off, like what main challenges would you consider in achieving observability in serverless architectures compared to like more traditional ones?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, right, is put an agent on there. So you're kind of at the mercy of what AWS allows you to do, or I'm just saying AWS in particular, but any serverless platform out there. what they allow you to monitor, and what tools are available, right? And what support the serverless monitoring. Again, yeah, things are a lot better than they used to be. When Lambda first came out, it was pretty challenging, but things have come a long way. So, yeah, but I'm excited to talk about it more in depth, each one.
Yeah. And I mean, with that, I think working with any cloud provider, you're really going to get a suite of tools that are set up to work together in one way or another. So kind of maybe separate from a traditional server environment where you're installing all the tools yourself and you have to, I mean, you're going to pick the tools that work together as well when you're installing it in your system. But when you're working with the cloud provider, they're going to provide the logging, the, observability, or I should say, the monitoring and the tracing tools that are going to work together. In my mind, like we were talking about, we have the logging, which is how you're storing the data. That's really the meat and potatoes of the data you're getting out of your system and storing somewhere. Monitoring is some way where you're using that data to create metrics or create alerts or using a visualization tool. And then the tracing is going to be, in my mind, you're really digging down to troubleshoot some kind of issue or maybe not even troubleshoot, just analyze that flow of the data through your application. And so cloud provider is certainly going to have that integration between those three pieces available to you and easy to connect through all those stages.
Yeah, I'd say another difference in traditional observability, in the sense with serverless, is there's the infrastructure, if you will, and application logging, monitoring, observability is a lot more tightly coupled, I'd say, put together, right? Like all one pane of glass that you're seeing, versus more traditional. There's a legacy where the infrastructure logs and metrics are kind of separated from the application. Something that, yeah, I see as a good thing, but it's different than traditional monitoring observability, I'd say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you both hit on some really good points when analyzing sort of the differences between, what observability looks like from a serverless architecture versus traditional. Some of the limitations, like there are, on the one hand, with the vendor-specific monitoring and tooling, you have a lot that is automatically integrated with the platform of your choice, but you tend to be more typically locked in than rather than having the full suite of tools at your disposal. There's some that are more naturally integratable, I guess you could say. Also, like you definitely touched on the limited control over, well, I shouldn't say control, but I guess server access, right? So like, people who are more used to being able to just, SSH into their server and kind of poke around at the OS level, that's not necessarily achievable through a serverless architecture. I mean, it like you said, Tom, it has come a long way, but it's definitely is. There's a bit of a mindset shift when looking at the observability through the lens of serverless. So let's talk a little bit about. I actually kind of want to get into tracing quite a lot more. So Preston, can you go into like tracing in a little bit more detail, like not just at a high level, but perhaps some of your personal experiences using the tools potentially in AWS. I mean, I can speak to X-Ray, for example, but that's something that I'm more familiar with than some of the tools available to like Azure, for instance. But
well, certainly that's what I was going to bring up is AWS X-Ray. That's I think AWS's preferred tracing mechanism. And like I said, I think this is really about you've you're really interested in the performance of an application, or there's a problem somewhere and you need to figure out what's going on. If you have an application or your application's instrumented, meaning you have them wired up to report this tracing information to the service, let's say Amazon X-Ray, function calls, API calls, these are reported to your tracing service, and you get this metadata about what happens at each step. So let's say you have your application with your functions instrumented to log. And so you can, filter through these traces that show how long the function took or how long the API request took. Maybe you added some metadata about the response from the API request. And so even with that data, you can aggregate that and average that out to give you interesting metrics about the average, length of time something's taken. It makes it really helpful to pinpoint, like, okay, this specific API request is taking a really long time overall. That's really the biggest issue in our system. Maybe we're writing to disk or something, and we find that, oh yeah, that write to disk is really what's taking all of our time. That's why this API is responding so slow, or an example like that. So tracing, in my mind, really helps you target and find the root cause of potential issues, or where to find more performance improvements.
Yeah, I just like to say it has gotten a lot better, right? But going back to when I said you're kind of at the mercy of what the provider platform allows you to do with tracing, right? When you had a lot more control, you could add that metadata, add those tracing IDs to every single call going through your services. Whereas X-Ray is a lot better, but when it first came out, there was only so many services that were supporting it, right? So you would have gaps in what was other AWS services were being called. But yes, it has gotten a lot better, and yeah, it is a lot nicer using X-Ray.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I love about it is that because, as you say, it's been continuously improved over time. Anytime that you have I should say it works with most other services, but when you have your Lambda function, for example, that needs to reach out to Dynamo or to RDS to make queries, you can actually trace some of that in X-Ray to be able to see, like, okay, well, what's my latency like with my database or my data stores, right? Is there something that I need to improve there? It has a lot of implications, not only with where something might be getting stopped up, but also performance, like you were mentioning too, Preston. And I do really like that there's additional support for requests. Like, for example, if you're using Python, you can use the requests module or library to make outgoing web requests from your Lambda function. And that is actually supported, and you can see how long each API request takes, and if there was an issue. But that said, again, there's only some that are supported, and there are some limitations surrounding that, right? So, and I would like to dig into that a little bit more too. So in your experience, Preston, when you were interacting with and using X-Ray, like, what kinds of limitations would you run into? Like, what were some things that you would consider challenges for achieving observability with distributed tracing?
Sure. It's kind of like what you said. Some, let's say, and I'm talking about, application side of something. So I know Tom was talking about other AWS services that specifically have reporting to, like, X-Ray. In the scope of, like, building your own application, and say you're including dependency libraries, Jason mentioned, like, an HTTP client requests, like in Python. Some of these libraries have integration with the X-Ray tool. And when I say X-Ray tool, I mean the X-Ray library that reports to X-Ray. some of those have integration built right in, and it's very coupled nicely. Other libraries that you use that make requests to maybe a database, maybe some other third-party service aren't going to have that kind of X-ray integration. So you're only going to get so much level of tracing to a certain point. But usually if you encapsulate that call to a service, say a database or something, inside of a function that you instrument with X-Ray, you'll still get the metrics, and if something, in the case of something having a lot of latency, you'll figure out that it's this service that's the problem, and you can troubleshoot that specific service more. That's the biggest issue with X-Ray. I have a few issues with, I think, the specific AWS console UI display for tracing. Just in my experience, it's not the most user-friendly console they have. They could improve that. And I've only been using it for maybe 3 or 4 years, that console. So like Tom said, it probably has improved, but I think they have a little ways to go in terms of usability, in querying those traces.
I agree. It has come a long way, but yeah, it's still kind of rough.
Right. Yeah, I do know that just recently they did move some of that into CloudWatch proper. So if you do go through the AWS console, you can actually view the traces, the X-ray traces in the map in CloudWatch. I think that's definitely improved somewhat. But yeah, there's some that's lacking. But yeah, I wanted to ask you too, Tom, like, have you seen any specific challenges or issues with using distributed tracing tools, like not necessarily X-Ray, but maybe potentially others as well?
Yes, we would use other monitoring tools. One that I was very familiar with was New Relic, and it would kind of like, inject its own IDs, and kind of like other tools would do, it kind of inject its own tracing IDs so that, when it feeds back to the collectors, right, it can kind of wire it up together, and it was kind of nice. But yeah, that's I haven't played around with that in a long time. I've been kind of out of the game, the serverless app development game, for at least 6-8 months now. But now I'm back in, so I'm excited to see what has changed with AWS and diving deeper into it. Right, I've just skimmed the surface so far these past few weeks. So yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's it's definitely, it changes a lot. There's a lot that's been changing throughout the years and even months. So, but yeah, with distributed tracing with X-Ray specifically, I know that I've been able to use it just to provide some of my own experience, to provide that window of insight into what's going on with the system. Like when you have the event that's triggered, a segment is created, and that gives you a through line, so to speak. So you can see like where a message is going from one component to the next, and having that map just to give you a visual representation of, okay, well, here are my components. As long as you have everything instrumented correctly and set up right, it can be almost like an architecture diagram, like instantly gives you that.
Yeah.
Which is a very powerful thing. But yeah, just some of the limitations that I've run into as well is specifically with Lambda. I know that Lambda does some, it initiates a segment for you. I think like the actual Lambda execution will start a segment. But that can sometimes be at odds if you're starting segments and subsegments yourself within the Lambda, and so that can sometimes disrupt the trace. So like it'll look like there's a gap, right, or just like there'll be two disconnected graphs. So that's something to keep in mind, is be very careful with the way that the components are being instrumented.
Right.
Yeah,
and go ahead, Tom.
I was just saying that is nice, being able to give you that architecture diagram. Like I said, I just jumped into taking over a few applications and not documented that well. But yeah, just being able to see that tracing, they did have that implemented, and yeah, being able to see that the architecture, the flow of the information, all of that has been very helpful and helped me get up to speed on it. Yeah.
I've never heard of an application not being documented well. First time.
Right.
I agree, and one of the things you can do with, say, X-Ray is not only visualize that service map, those traces, but you can also, since X-Ray is integrated into CloudWatch, which is AWS's logging essentially service, you can create alarms which are alerts off of traces. So say you have, X number of requests that are above this amount of latency, you can create alarms and alerts off of that tracing. So because those services are provided, they integrate together and really give you that ability to not only see the traces and data, but also take action on those.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I want to dig into a little bit more too, is like how you can correlate the data with like between the distributed tracing data, have that work with logging and monitoring together. Yeah, I mean, Tom, do you have any other experience, like previous experience with like integrating that into monitoring? I mean, you mentioned New Relic, which I hadn't realized that they provide tracing, but like, are you able to integrate that with the monitoring portion of what New Relic provides? Like,
Yeah, they really upped their game in that, and they enabled logging and the tracing a few years back, and really kind of incorporated it all together, and it was really nice. And that's what I kind of miss, like being now like just in AWS, being able to see that kind of cohesively together. They try, but it's just not quite there, right? It was really nice, and you were like here's the air, right? Okay, easily jump here, the logs tracing everything around that, kind of going back and forth. Whereas with AWS, it's still a lot of, got to jump over here and redo the query now because it's, it didn't come over right, or the date didn't come over the time window and all of that. But it's getting better. But yeah, it was not as good as it was with New Relic.
okay. So so kind of like a bit of a tangent, but something I wanted to ask you about as well, Preston, is about security and compliance. Like, how could we use something like distributed tracing to help with to improve security and better compliance practices for our serverless architecture?
Sure. I have a couple thoughts about a couple other services that kind of fall into this with AWS. But with X-Ray, you can add metadata, and in other tracing services too. Adding in metadata that you want, so you can add in, user IDs, client IDs, that kind of thing, enriching your traces. So, like you said, with say tracking a record identifier or something across multiple services, you could do something similar with, user IDs, where you can, track those, and you can find out who's accessing data. That's one way to use those traces. That's probably to track user access. That might be one of the best ways to do it. I was thinking more of some other services though, like AWS CloudTrail, which I think is enabled by default in an AWS account, which gives you logs of all the user actions that take place, as well as service actions. And that creates a log for, you can report on for compliance reports or security analysis. That's something across your entire account, like cloud account, that you can use to see that kind of user access. And so for overall account, CloudTrail is something that is very useful for that. I think for application side logging, you still might need other logs that are creating that kind of data. You can make those reports, those compliance reports, security can review. I wouldn't necessarily say CloudTrail is good for reporting on what applications are doing. That's more for reporting on the actions that happen inside of your AWS account. And maybe we'll touch on it here in a second, but for doing those application level logs, you have several options besides just using CloudWatch, which is kind of your standard logging tool. You have things like Amazon TimeStream, which is a schemaless database that integrates with several services, is very fast to store data from applications and view it. Another tool called AWS Athena, which is another query-like tool, although it's not its own database. Athena uses AWS Glue and AWS S3. The data lives in AWS S3, and Athena uses Glue, which is basically a schema definition that says, here's how the columns in the files in S3 should be laid out, or here's the format in S3 that I'm expecting. And so kind of using Glue, Athena can query logs that are written to files in S3. So the TimeStream database and Athena with S3 are very useful for doing application level logging on top of CloudWatch.
Right, absolutely. And to kind of touch,
I know that kind of went off topic on your compliance and security analysis, but those are just very tools we use, my company, to write those logs that can be used by either graphing tools, dashboards, or like our security team to analyze what applications are doing and build reports.
right, yeah, that's definitely on topic too, because that's a core part of observability, right? Yeah, using those tools to be able to provide that window, and like you said, with TimeStream acting as a repository for your like your data that's keyed off of timestamps to provide an insight of what's happening, across time in your environments is really good. I mean, using that with something like Grafana, right, is something that can provide a lot of really good visualizations to be able to see what's going on in your environment. Yeah, and to kind of touch on what you said before too, with the security stuff, I mean, having that integrated with your monitoring so that you can ingest that data and then trigger alerts based off of whether or not you're detecting security incidents, using that data is something that could be extremely useful. And you're being more quick to react when something does happen. Yeah, and sort of another use case, I guess I'll throw the question over to you, Tom. Like I was curious as to your thoughts of how you can use data like that for cost optimization, and how to potentially reduce the cost of an environment that's sort of running up the bill, so to speak.
I mean, that's you need the observability, right, to see what you're paying. So you kind of have to have it, and the better observability that you have across all those services and what they're costing, the better, right? Especially distributed tracing to see what is being called by your application. I think, yeah, it's very helpful. I don't think about it too much because it just kind of goes hand in hand, right? That is, where you look at where your costs are being, where your costs are coming from.
I think that's good because, I think logs are always something that you're like, oh yeah, the application's logging, but those logs are living somewhere. They're taking up space. They're costing money being stored somewhere. So certainly log generation is on top of being able to view the cost of your services, those logs cost money too, in terms of, storing them, how long you want to store them for. Those are, issues with traditional logging too, like log rotation, retention. But I think with a cloud platform, you're going to get the same kind of tools to be able to manage those attributes of the logs. But obviously, traditional platforms aren't going to kind of sum up, here's all the costs for you. Like something like AWS, they have a cost explorer where you can see, oh, here's what these services are costing you right now, and you can visualize the trends right there, which is very helpful and useful for seeing. I know from some previous example, from some previous history, sometimes we might have seen a large cost and we're like, where's all this money coming from? And we see, CloudWatch has a huge expense, and it's like, oh, there's some application that's just writing tons of unnecessary logs, and it's just racking up costs.
Reading from them, especially using third-party tools. That's what we've experienced a lot. So yeah, when you talk about cost optimization, for the application, it's, if you're going serverless, there's really not that much you can optimize outside of traditional infrastructure. The cost optimization, like Russ was saying, really comes down to optimizing for your logging, right? That's where I've seen it the most, and your monitoring, and keep an eye on that, because with this serverless infrastructure, it usually costs about the same, if not more, to do logging and, this observability. So that's, more importantly than your application costs is monitoring your monitoring costs.
I think it's because a lot of times they enable logging tools and services by default, and you might not realize that they're turned on. And they have so many services that, you start accruing costs that you didn't expect.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. That's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. And yeah, I also just kind of throw in too that I like using X-Ray or just distributed tracing in general to see, like, what resources, I'm actually using, like what, for something that's pay as you go or pay for what you use, that gives you a pretty accurate insight into, okay, well, this is what I'm using, again, provided with the caveat that you have things instrumented correctly. So, yeah.
I like to put workloads, right? Each environment and workload in its own AWS account. That's the best, thing that I've seen for monitoring costs, right? And be able to associate it. Yes, this is just production of this workload, or this application, or this is development, right, of this application. But yeah, it is beneficial. But I recommend, separating out your workloads and environment into separate AWS accounts. That's makes it a lot easier for permissions and then costs, and being able to observe costs.
All right. So yeah, I think we are coming up on time here, but I wanted to save a little bit of time for final thoughts. So yeah, Tom, did you have any final thoughts on serverless observability?
Just final thoughts. I'm excited to get back into it again, and this has got me thinking about it more. But yeah, I'd be excited to do another talk right in the future, and what I've learned in my new journey coming up here, getting back into the serverless app dev.
All right, excellent. And Preston, how about you? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like we touched on, there's many services to use to do logging, and the services can target different aspects of that logging. As we lightly touched on, I don't think we really got into a lot of them, or at least several of the services that I was thinking of really heavily. But there's a lot of power in the cloud platforms for viewing the logs. I've been really getting into Grafana a lot, which is a third-party product that integrates into AWS that allows you to, like other dashboard tools, allows you to visualize the data that you log into several of these logging frameworks. It just provides so much value and visibility into your systems, especially when you build systems that really aren't, UI centric, don't have user interfaces. You have a lot of APIs or just backend systems. It really opens up like obviously it really tells you in a visual way what's happening. And I think that goes a long way, especially with people that aren't so technical on your teams and companies, to see that information. So there's a lot I've learned along the way too, in terms of costs, and querying, a lot of aspects I think we can touch on. We probably could have another talk on this as well.
Yeah, this is definitely such a big topic that it may deserve part two in the future fairly soon. So, okay, well, yeah, I guess with that, we can probably wrap up. I would like to thank all of the listeners for tuning in to today's episode. And I'd like to thank you both again, Tom and Preston, and thank you, Joe, as well. But yeah, hopefully all of our listeners found the conversation informative and valuable. And we'd love to have you join us again for the next episode. And our topic for next time is object-oriented programming versus functional programming. And always, the episode will feature expert guests and interactive conversations, so be sure to tune in. Thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Good one.